I was so excited by the results of the American election that I've undergone a personal metamorphosis. I am a Canadian, but on my badge it says USA. And this is immensely reassuring to me because frequently when I speak in the United States, when I have finished speaking, I have the very strong sense that the audience feels I belong in Guantanamo. So it's almost more than my frail psyche can endure to be in such auspicious circumstances. I have unbridled admiration for CARE as well as for Helene. I have watched CARE work on the ground frequently in relation to HIV and AIDS in Africa. I've seen them work in my own country. I know the fastidious and preoccupying devotion to the grassroots and to community level which suffuses CARE activities, and I have nothing but strong admiration and respect for the work you do. And I think this conference reflects that. I was looking through the program, and it's positively encyclopedic in content and touches on so many aspects of CARE's work in such a remarkably integrated and knowledgeable way with very, very expert presenters. And therefore, the quality of the next 3 days is obviously going to be innately admirable. The subject matter I was asked to deal with, who leads the fight against poverty, I actually will deal with. I make it a principle in speeches to pay no attention whatsoever to the subject matter. But in this instance, I'm much taken with the focus and would like to address it with a series of general reflections, which I will deliver with supernatural rapidity because I want to cover a lot of ground. And I beg you to bear with me until the end, where I shall try to pull things together with some kind of symmetrical coherence. First, up till about 1 month ago, the World Bank definition of poverty was at $1 a day and was said to encompass 930 million people. The World Bank then revised the analytic critique which it had applied to the definition of poverty, came to the conclusion that it should be $1.25 a day, and that yielded 1.4 billion people below the poverty line. It then pointed out that another 100 million people had been added to the lists in the last several months as a result of soaring food prices, and therefore, when you take it all together, we have nearly 1/4 of humankind living below the poverty line as etched by the World Bank, and certainly more than half of humankind living below $2 a day. The soaring food prices, of course, have the corollary reality of huge amounts of land being taken out of food production for the ephemeral search for biofuels, which now seems to be mistaken in its construct. And if I may detour slightly, it's worth pointing out that even though we had a gathering of all the major countries in the world in Rome just 5 months ago, promising $12 billion to address the food crisis, thus far, 5 months later, it has yielded but $1 billion. And Oxfam recently indicated that this was a dreadful betrayal of the promises that had been made. So much for the Millennium Development Goals on poverty if we cannot possibly meet the kinds of poverty levels which are extant. Number two, I was fascinated to note that just at the end of October, and this passed by largely without reference, Professor Fukuda Par, who was the author of the astonishing Human Development Report for the UNDP, produced a working paper for the International Poverty Center studying the poverty strategy, the poverty reduction strategy papers, taking a look at these poverty reduction strategy papers in the context of their value. These papers, of course, were the substitute for the structural adjustment programs of the World Bank and the IMF and are held with an almost religious fidelity. Fukuda Par, who is rooted in UNDP, which has overseen a great deal of the poverty reduction strategy, pointed out, after looking at 22 developing countries and 21 bilateral donors, that the PRSPs are undercutting their core policy purposes, close quote. She indicated that they neglect, quote, decent work, hunger, and nutrition, close quote. How in heaven's name you deal with poverty reduction strategy papers and you avoid decent work, hunger, and nutrition is beyond the capacity of the mind to absorb. She then points out, and I'm quoting, the single most effective revision could be to add a goal of reducing inequality in income and other dimensions of poverty within and between nations, end quote. Now, it's really quite fascinating that so trenchant a mind can be brought to bear on the PRSPs years after they are put in place and find them in so many respects fundamentally flawed in terms of the target and the object for which they were intended. So on the one hand, you have a redefinition of poverty which brings hundreds of millions of more people into the mix. On the other hand, you have an analysis of one of the chief policy instruments which we employ by someone who has every right to make the analysis and finds the employment wanting. Number three, I was much struck at the height of the financial turbulence by the press conference which Bono held in New York. And I don't feel at all cheeky as Robert Carr does. I feel enraged, incensed. I feel bewildered by the obscenity of what Bono disgorged. He said, with that exasperating edge which flits through his voice, that it was amazing to him that in a matter of 48 hours, the United States could find $700 billion to bail out Wall Street. But all of the countries of the G8 collectively could not find $25 billion, which had been promised at the G8 summit in Gleneagles in July of 2005 and would be directed to Africa. And what was the $25 billion intended to do? It was intended to address the Millennium Development Goals. And if the $25 billion, which were to be yielded by the year 2010, could be repeated year after year till 2015, the final date of the Millennium Development Goals, then, said Bono and many others with him, from Jeffrey Sachs to Joe Stiglitz, we could indeed meet the Millennium Development Goals in Africa. As it is, we have yielded only $4 billion thus far. And it is now absolutely clear that the commitments that were made at Gleneagles will not be met, and those commitments will have a tremendously damaging effect on the impoverished citizens of this planet.